They say that the desert does not keep secrets, it only returns them to the wind. Each grain of sand seems to carry memories of men who chose solitude in exchange for survival. In the West, justice does not arrive with uniforms or courts, but with the marks left by time, by the blood spilled, and by the silence of those who have gone. There, hope is mixed with dust, and even love seems like a shadow that hesitates to touch the ground. Jack, a middle-aged farmer, lived in isolation on land where the sun punished even the toughest bones. His hands were thick, scarred by plows and fire, and his skin bore scars that reminded him of ancient battles against drought and against men who came armed in search of what did not belong to them. It carried the weight of equal days, where the wind creaked at the wooden gates and the horizon seemed to promise only more silence. He was expecting a wife, not out of youthful romanticism, but out of the need to share the hard life with someone who could endure the same aridity. The ranch he had built with effort was small compared to the vastness that surrounded it. A barn stood as a solitary guardian in the dust, a witness to years of work and resistance. It was in front of him that Jack waited for the woman who would agree to share that desert with her ghosts. There was something ceremonial about waiting for him, as if life was about to present him with a destiny he had never dared to imagine. Time ran slowly, the sun burned high, and the emptiness seemed to extend forever. Then a silhouette appeared on the horizon that was impossible to ignore. With each step, the dust raised revealed not only the presence of someone, but the promise of something that escaped logic. A woman, larger than the barn that held the fruits of her entire life, was approaching firmly, bringing with her an aura of strangeness and strength that defied explanation. At that moment, Jack didn't know if he was witnessing a miracle, a threat, or just a new form of loneliness. The wind fell silent, as if even the barren land awaited the next move. It was the beginning of a history that could not be erased, because certain apparitions in the West are not enough to be forgotten, but to change forever the destiny of those who find them. The West had a habit of testing men with visions that bordered on madness. Some saw mirages of rivers that never existed, others swore they heard the voices of the dead lost in the wind, but in front of Jack there was no illusion. The figure of the woman advanced with slow, steady steps, and each one of them seemed to weigh more than the promises that the farmer had made to himself in nights of loneliness. It was not a delusion. It was flesh, shadow, and presence. Jack remained motionless, as if time had refused to move forward. The dust stuck to his skin, and the sun burned against his eyes, but nothing made him dodge in that colossal way. The woman carried in her body the hardness of a life that defied any human limit. His shoulders seemed to carry more than physical weight. They carried stories of invisible struggles, scars that did not need to be shown. The dirt road, so customary for Jack, now took on a different meaning. Every second that passed transformed that arid scenario into the stage for something bigger. The horses imprisoned in the stable were restless, as if they sensed that the fate of the ranch would be marked by that arrival. Even the wood of the barn creaked in the wind, as an anxious witness to the unexpected. In the farmer's heart, the loneliness that once seemed part of his flesh was now beginning to be questioned. There was fear, there was amazement, but there was also a silent call that could not be ignored. The desert, accustomed to consuming hopes, seemed to offer him an enigma, a choice that would forever change the course of his days. The woman larger than the barn stopped in front of the ranch. He didn't need words. His mere presence was already a sentence. Jack understood, without being said, that the West had not just sent him a companion, but a mystery that would test his courage, his faith, and his heart, marked by the aridity of life. And the silence that followed was heavier than any shot ever heard under that sun. The West always imposed choices that could not be avoided. Men and women who arrived in those lands knew that nothing remained neutral. Every gesture, every look, every silence carried an invisible weight. The arrival of this larger-than-barn woman was not just an unusual event, but a break in the dry, predictable order that Jack had learned to endure. He watched as her shadow cast itself on the worn wood of the ranch. It was as if the earth itself recognized its presence, bowing in respect to the impossible. The wind, which had always brought dust and oblivion, now seemed to blow in reverence, carrying in the air a promise of change that Jack still didn't know if he could bear. There was something in her that could not be explained with words, but that could be felt in her bones, an ancestral force, as if it had been shaped by the same sun that cracked the earth and by the same darkness that rocked the endless nights. There was no softness in his posture, only firmness. And yet, behind that grandeur, there was a silence that conveyed more humanity than any gesture of tenderness. Jack, a man accustomed to dealing with the harshness of the seasons and the cruelty of armed men, felt that his solitude was no longer protected. It was as if his own life was being torn from the dry ground and exposed to the unknown. And in this discomfort grew an uncertain feeling, the feeling that his fate was somehow tied to her fate. The sun slowly descended, tinting the horizon with reddish hues, and the ranch looked smaller in that light. The desert did not give answers, it only echoed questions. And on that evening, the greatest of all was clear. What was a woman who defied any human measure looking for in lands as arid as these? The West had the uncanny ability to turn the night into a silent court. When the sun went down behind the dry hills, only the moon was left, judging every step, every decision, every shadow that dared to stand. That night, Jack realized that his ranch was no longer the same. Silence no longer came from loneliness, but from expectation. There was something in the air, dense, as if the desert was breathing deeper. The woman stood there, motionless, like a sentinel who needed no rest. His presence altered the way the wind moved, how the animals reacted, how Jack's own heart beat. He knew without understanding that she was not just an unexpected bride, but a guardian brought by fate. The wood of the barn creaked, the horses neighed restlessly, and every noise seemed to foreshadow a change that could no longer be contained. The dark sky was filled with distant stars, but none seemed to offer consolation. The Wild West rarely gave peace to those who dared to stay. Jack felt the night lengthen, stretching shadows that tested him. The past of ambushes, losses, and scars returned in fragmented memories, like echoes of battles that never faded. The West did not forgive those who relaxed, and he knew that his whole life had been a preparation for moments like that. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a familiar and feared sound, distant hooves, approaching at a paced pace, mixed with muffled laughter and the rustle of worn leather. The sound did not belong to peaceful travelers. It was the announcement of men who carried the law of brutality in their arms, outlaws appearing like vultures attracted by the smell of cultivated land and the promise of plunder. Jack didn't move a muscle, but his chest tightened. The wind brought to him the smell of the dust raised by the horses and the certainty that his loneliness had ended not by love, but by violence. And while the shadows of the nights grew under the moon, the woman stood firm, upright against the darkness, as if the night had at last found a force capable of facing it. In the West, violence never asked permission. It arrived like the dry wind, passing through doors, silencing birds, erasing any memory of peace. The outlaws advanced, and the sound of their hooves resounded like a doom announcement. Every step of the horses made the earth tremble, and Jack knew there was no way to avoid what was coming. The ranch seemed to shrink under the threat. The windows reflected distorted shadows, and the barn, which had always been a symbol of his effort, now appeared as a target. The dust raised by the mounts hid the faces of these men, but it was not necessary to see them to recognize them. The desert always brought back the same figures, greedy, brutal, ready to consume the sweat of those who insisted on resisting. Jack remained motionless. His body carried the memory of old battles, but his mind knew that age no longer offered him the same speed as before. He was no longer the man who drew before the enemy. It was now the farmer who depended on the land and the weather, and both were ruthless. The loneliness that had always accompanied him seemed to expose him even more to that inevitable threat. But the woman, bigger than her barn, did not move. It stood before the ranch like a wall of flesh and bones, defying approaching fate. There was a certainty in his posture that did not need to be explained. It was as if she had been born for that moment, shaped not to flee, but to face. His silence weighed more than any battle cry, and his presence made the night tremble. The outlaws dismantled. His boots met the dry ground with footsteps that smelled of doom. They surrounded the ranch, confident, like vultures ready to devour what was left of life on that piece of land. The West always demanded a price, and that night, Jack understood that his survival would not be decided by his hands, but by the choices of an impossible figure that fate had placed in his path. The West always tested its children to the limit of endurance. It was not enough to cultivate the land, nor to erect fences. Sooner or later, lawless men would come to demand the price of survival. That night, under the pale moonlight, this trial had finally arrived at Jack's ranch. The outlaws fanned out around the property, steady footsteps, guns gleaming under the darkness. The air smelled of sweat, leather, and gunpowder about to be awakened. Jack remained still, his heart beating heavy as hammers against his chest. His eyes, however, were not fixed on the enemies, but on the woman whom fate had placed before him. It was she, and not he, who seemed to carry the answer that the night demanded. With the serenity of someone who had been born among storms, the woman advanced. His body cast giant shadows over the dry land, and his footsteps reverberated like thunder. There was no hurry, no hesitation, only the inevitability of force. The men laughed in derision, but the wind seemed to stifle any sound before it could gain power. The desert, in silence, awaited the outcome. When the first outlaw raised his gun, the world seemed to hold its breath. The answer did not come from Jack, but from her. With a movement that mixed brutality and precision, the woman disarmed the man and threw him to the ground as if he were just another handful of dust. The impact echoed, breaking the laughter of others and awakening in them something stronger than greed, fear. Jack felt the weight of the scene as if time had dissolved. That ranch, which had always been only a scene of loneliness and toil, now became the scene of an impossible event. The woman bigger than her barn was not a mirage, nor a coincidence. It was the embodiment of strength that the West rarely offered. And as Jack faced lawless men, he realized for the first time in many years that salvation could come from where he least expected it. The West never allowed neutrality. When violence came, it required every man and woman to choose between life and death, between honor and surrender. That night, under the moon that illuminated the dust suspended in the air, Jack was a witness to the silent trial that only brutality could impose. The outlaws, accustomed to seeing the fear in the eyes of their victims, hesitated before the colossal woman. Still, greed pushed them forward. One of them advanced with the blade gleaming in the dark, certain that its size was only an illusion, but the kook never met its destination. With the same naturalness of someone pulling weeds from the earth, she knocked him down, leaving his body motionless against the hard ground. The reaction was immediate. 2 shots cut through the night, the dry sound echoing through the valley. Jack felt the impact of gunpowder in the air and the breath of death passing close to him. His hand instinctively reached for the gun on his waist, but the slowness of age betrayed him. For a moment he knew that this would be the end of him. He would fall like so many other men, another name erased by the desert. It was then that she intervened. His huge body blocked the path of violence as if it were a wall erected by the earth itself. The glow of the bullets was lost in nothingness, and the outlaws retreated in the face of the impossible. Jack stood still, his heart beating with the certainty that it had been torn from the brink of death. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of fear. The men retreated, realizing too late that they had launched themselves against something they could not overcome. Jack, in turn, felt a transformation that did not come from blood or gunpowder. It was an awakening within him. For the first time since loneliness had become his only companion, a different warmth ran through his soul. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, more inevitable, as immense as the figure of the woman who now stood before him. In the West, every victory had the bitter taste of survival. Nothing was achieved without cost, and each act of courage left traces that echoed far beyond the night. The confrontation was over as quickly as it had begun, but the marks it had left would remain etched not only on dry land, but on Jack's memory. The dust, which still hung in the air, seemed to hold in suspension the story of a man saved against all odds. The outlaws dissipated into the darkness like wounded animals, carrying with them the memory of a power they could not explain. All that remained was the ranch, the barn, and the presence of the colossal woman, motionless before the moon, as if she were part of the desert itself. The wind blew again, slower, colder, bringing with it the weight of silence after the storm. Jack took a deep breath, feeling his heart hammer in his chest. For years, his life had been made up of simple routines, working the land, caring for the cattle, facing droughts and storms alone. Loneliness was a habit that had become flesh. But that night, something in him broke. The instant the bullets crossed the air and death would reach him if it weren't for the presence of that woman had changed everything. It wasn't just gratitude, it was as if a forgotten part of his soul had been torn from the dust and brought back to life. He looked at her. There was no beauty in the common mold. There was no delicacy in the features, nor softness in the proportions, but there was an imposing place that defied any human logic. She was not only bigger than the barn that kept her work, it was greater than any memory he had of protection, greater than any promise of survival the desert had given him. In that huge body, Jack saw a symbol, the strength he had never dared to hope for. The woman remained silent, as if nothing had happened. His eyes, reflecting the pale light of the moon, carried a firmness that needed no explanation. Jack, for his part, felt a whirlwind of thoughts that he couldn't organize. How could he love a figure that frightened him, that reduced him, that represented something almost supernatural? And yet, within him, a flame was born that was difficult to contain. It was not sudden passion, but a slow, inevitable recognition, like the blossoming of a plant that insists on growing in the most arid soil. The ranch looked different that night. The barn was no longer just a wooden shelter, but a witness to a destiny that changed before his eyes. Jack knew that his life would never be the same. The West always demanded choices, and this was the hardest she had ever faced, to give up her loneliness and accept the impossible as part of herself. As the wind carried the smell of gunpowder and dry land, Jack realized that he was not just alive, he was awake. For the first time in many years, death did not seem so close to him. For the first time in so many winters, there was a promise of warmth, even if born of the unexpected. The desert had given her a chance, and she had the form of a woman that no measure could contain. In the West, nothing was given without first being wrested by force. Rivers dried up, herds died, men grew old before their time. The land offered no promises, only resistance. And yet, on that night when death had passed so close, Jack felt something bloom inside him that didn't match that arid scenery. It was not just relief, nor just survival. It was the strange feeling that life, for the first time in a long time, was delivering him an unexpected gift. The ranch still kept the smell of gunpowder. The wood crackled in the early morning cold, and the horses breathed heavily, trying to regain their calm after the violence. Jack walked slowly, feeling every muscle in his body weigh like lead, but it was not the weight of defeat, it was the weight of a revelation. His eyes did not move away from her. The woman remained upright, motionless, as if the desert itself had decided to protect him through his colossal figure. Inside, Jack was fighting a battle that could not be seen from the outside. For years, he had learned to distrust everything: the law, men, even time. He had created a shield against illusions and had convinced himself that love was nothing more than a mirage that the western sun dissipated sooner or later. But as he saw her disarm men, as he felt her come between him and death, something that had been dormant in his breast rose again. It was not passing gratitude. It was a desire to stay alive, not only for oneself, but to walk alongside that presence. She didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Her silence was more eloquent than any oath, and that silence was seeping into Jack, dissolving the fears that had sustained him for decades. For the first time, he felt no less for being in front of a greater force. On the contrary, he felt whole, as if he had finally found the space he was missing. Dawn began to dawn on the horizon, dyeing the sky red and gold. The light revealed her body against the barren scenery, and Jack couldn't look away. The West, which had always seemed to him a place of doom, now became the scene of an improbable hope. He knew it was not a simple choice. To love her meant to face not only the strangeness of difference, but also the cruel judgment of men who would never understand. Still, the flame that had been born in his chest was stronger than any fear. As the sun rose, Jack realized he was no longer alone. The loneliness that had defined him until then had been broken not by sweet words, but by an act of courage that had saved his life. At that moment, he understood that love in the West did not appear in verses nor in promises, but in blood, in silence, and in gestures capable of defying death itself. And within himself, he accepted the impossible. He was in love with her. Jack stood there in front of the barn, looking at the woman who had changed the course of his life in a single night. The rising sun illuminated his colossal figure, casting a shadow that stretched until it reached him, as if enveloping him in protection. He did not back down. For the first time, he did not feel overwhelmed by that presence. On the contrary, he discovered in himself a silent belonging, as if his whole life had waited for that moment. The days that followed brought marks of the confrontation. The ranch still displayed the traces of violence, bullet marks on the wood, footprints deep in the dry ground, memories that time would not easily erase. But Jack no longer looked at it as signs of threat. I saw them as witnesses of the transformation I had experienced. Each scar on the ranch reflected his own, and alongside it, he discovered that even wounds could become the foundations of a new life. The woman did not leave. She stood there, silent, helping with the work of the land, lifting loads that no man could move, protecting the boundaries of the property with the same firmness she had shown that night. Jack watched her gestures with a mixture of reverence and tenderness. There was no delicacy in her forms, but there was a strange beauty in her strength, an inescapable truth that made him feel smaller and at the same time greater than ever. Over time, Jack no longer saw in her only the guardian who had saved him. He began to see a companion, an inseparable part of himself. He discovered that love did not manifest itself only in soft words or future promises, but in the silent constancy of a presence that remained when everything around seemed to crumble. In his heart, loneliness slowly dissolved, giving way to a warmth he had never believed he deserved. And so, in the silence of the days and the weight of the nights, Jack realized that he had not chosen this woman. He had been chosen by her. Fate, in its cruelty and grandeur, had offered him something that men rarely received: a chance for redemption, love, and peace. Under the shadow of that figure larger than his barn, Jack went from being just the lone farmer to becoming at last a complete man. Because there are encounters that cannot be explained, only lived, and some of them forever change the course of the soul itself. If this story has touched you in any way, stay with us. Here, each narrative holds reflections on courage, choices, and unexpected destinies. Their presence strengthens this space where the silence of the Wild West gains voice. There are many more journeys waiting to be told. Subscribe to the channel, enjoy this video, and follow each new report that time reveals.